I'm Joseph Rescigno, talking about my book, Conducting Opera, Where Theater Meets Music. In this video, I'd like to talk about comedy. Now, there is a legend that says a famous actor on his deathbed proclaimed, "Dying is easy, comedy is hard." I don't know if this story is true, but there's a lot of truth in that sentiment. First of all, timing is critical in comedy. The slightest miscalculation can kill something funny. Secondly, exaggeration wears very, very thin in comedy. You might be able to get away with it in a tragedy, but it can ruin a comedy. Also, in opera, comedy is vast. It goes from a Jacques Offenbach farce all the way to Richard Wagner's Die Meistersinger. So I'd like to narrow the scope for this video to Mozart and bel canto comedies. First of all, it tends to be the most performed. Secondly, these are the works probably given the beginning opera conductor, as opposed to, say, Falstaff, Johnny Schicchi, or certainly the Rosenkavalier. All right, what are the problems involved in doing comedy at this time, this era? First, there is orchestration and the evolution of instruments at this time. Remember that the brass instruments, especially trumpets and trombones, were much lighter and in some ways more primitive. The trumpets at this time couldn't do the kind of melodic, lyric writing that we hear in music 50, 60 years later. And the trombones were smaller instruments and lighter instruments than the modern symphony orchestra uses today. Even timpani tended to be lighter. Also, between 1800 and 1880, there was a great deal of evolution of the instruments, all kinds of instruments. One case in point is in Paris, an instrument called the cornet. Now, the cornet sounds very much like a trumpet, although it was adapted from the instrument called the flugelhorn. However, it had valves where the trumpets of that day didn't. It also was capable of a more delicate sound and a very legato sound. Now, we know that composers of this era often wrote roles for specific singers in mind. I think Donizetti wrote the following music for a specific instrument, the cornet. Why? It was invented in 1828 in Paris and manufactured by a French company. It was popular, and the opera Don Pasquale was commissioned by Paris in 1843. At this time, very often in bel canto operas, an aria was previewed. That is, before the singer sings it, a woodwind would play the melody first. Casta Diva of Norma by Bellini, before the soprano sings the aria, the flute plays the melody. In Donizetti's L'Elixir d'Amore, Elixir of Love, before the tenor sings his famous aria, Una furtiva lagrima, the bassoon plays the melody. In this case, Ernesto's aria, Cercherò lontana terra, before he sings his aria, virtually the entire aria, it's a really long introduction, is played by the trumpet. But I think it was a cornet because it's very lyrical and very beautiful. this continues for another page and a half before the tenor sings. So I told this some years back, a production I was doing of the opera. I talked about this with the trumpet player in the orchestra. He told me he had a cornet, that he liked playing it, and he would bring it in to the first rehearsal and we'd listen to it. Well, it sounded terrific, and we did the production with him playing just this number on the cornet, the rest of the opera on his trumpet. So, in addition to the evolving trumpet, we have the situation of the trombones and, in fact, the brass and timpani in general. At the beginning of this discussion, I said that these instruments were much lighter in the time of Mozart and bel canto. If in today's orchestra, with today's instruments, there are some balance problems, they can almost always be corrected by adjusting the dynamics. Making, for example, fortissimos in the brass just mezzo fortes, or forte piano if it's long notes. There is one exception. The opera L'Elisir d'Amore. For some reason, he wrote almost more trombone and trumpet and timpani even in this comedy than in some of the tragedies, than in Lucia, for example. And even adjusting the dynamics, he doubles the vocal line a lot with brass. He even doubles a run for the soprano by playing those notes on a single note, of course, but in the timpani. So I have access to the orchestra score of a famous conductor from the 20th century, not related to me, who did almost 60 tacits. He just bracketed certain notes and didn't play them. I can't go into that, all of them now, it would take hours. But a good musician can study the score carefully, see where notes are doubled, where the brass writing becomes thick, even if played piano, and make these tacits. The other question in comedy, whether it's this comedy or later comic pieces, is execution. I said that exaggeration is deadly in comedy, more so than in tragedy. Even when there is a traditional bit, in the previous video I talk about tradition, some good, some bad. Even when you have a very good traditional comic bit, it's funny once, it's not 3 times funnier when repeated 3 times. An example is the duet of Malatesta and Pasquale towards the end of the opera Don Pasquale. First, Pasquale has a rather long phrase. He sings alone. Then that is repeated with Malatesta, totally different text, singing alone. Then the two of them sing it together. Now, the first 2 times, Donizetti writes this figure in the violins underneath the vocal line so that no rubato is possible. It sounds like this. Aspetta, aspetta, cara sposina, la mia vendetta già s'avvicina, già ti preme, già t'ha raggiunto, tutti in un punto l'hai da scontare, vedrai che giovino raggina capo le sorrisi tenere, le lacrime. Okay. The same thing happens with Malatesta, with different text. When they sing together, there is nothing at that phrase in the orchestra. He doesn't do this figure. He just gives rest. So we say, we hear this. And tradition has the first 3 notes sung slowly. Vedrai che giovino regina cavoli sorrisi tenere sospiri lacrime. Okay, that's actually quite clever and quite funny. However, I have seen productions where the conductor tacits, that is, does not play the moving figure, so that every time you hear Vedrai che giovine regina cabale, and that's not funny. That's just sort of leaden. Another thing to consider is tempo. Remember, faster and faster does not mean funnier and funnier. Also, not everything in a comedy is farce. Not everything in a comedy is even funny. Sometimes there is something sad in a comedy. Sometimes there are romantic things. It's something called romantic comedy. And a case in point is the cabaletta of Adina in the opera L'Elisir d'Amore. It's marked allegro, but I encourage conductors and singers to think of it as allegro moderato. So you get, she's singing, please, to Nemorino, please forgive how cruel I was. From now on, I just want to make your life happy. And it should go at Il mio rigor dimentica, ti giuro eterno amore, si farti felice io bravo, ah, si giuro eterno amor. Now, I have heard it. Well, it makes a hash out of the romantic text, but more to the point, it kills the soprano. If she can get through the whole cabaletta at that tempo, it's almost a miracle. Another example of going too fast in a comedy is in Rossini's Italiana in Algeri. There is a duet early on between the tenor Lindoro and the bass Mustafa. It has very, very difficult text to say. It's marked allegro, but it should be a little slower than the typical Rossini allegro. Se che lei per moglie, ci vorrebbe tante cose. Se che lei per moglie, ci vorrebbe tante cose. You hear, that's really, the text sounds really fast. Any faster, it's unsingable to pronounce the words. I have heard it quite a bit faster. Well, you can imagine the duet did come to grief. Finally, we have a tempo to choose that could be done faster technically for vocal reasons, and it could even be done faster without spoiling the saying of the text. But it still would be wrong because it misses the spirit. And this case in point is in the opera La Fille du Régiment, the Daughter of the Regiment, that Donizetti wrote for Paris. It's a trio in the second act with Marie, Tonio, and Sulpice, the sergeant. It's charming. It's almost early operetta. And it should go about like this. There again, I've heard sometimes in performances taken a bit faster. It's possible, sure, but it's more slapstick, whereas this is really a Fred Astaire moment, an elegant, charming motive. So, we have the same thing I discuss with Marriage of Figaro and other operas in my book. I also, in the previous video, The Right Tempo, show this same thing in terms of different music from Don Giovanni and from Barber of Seville. The last thing I'd like to talk about is Recitativo. Recitativo, in this case, predominantly the operas of Mozart and of Rossini. It is when the singer is accompanied only by a harpsichord or piano. And it's where really the story unfolds. Character, mood, all of this is shown in the orchestral music, in the arias, but the actual facts, the actual action happens mostly in the recitativo. And some people think recitativo should just move fast, get it over with, and go on to the orchestral singing parts. Well, nothing could be farther from the truth. There is at least as much interest in telling the story as in singing the emotions. Now, also, comedy is not just fast. Sometimes a joke is much funnier when said slowly, with the right amount of pause before and after. In the opera Don Giovanni, the beginning of the opera is very dramatic, and it's just with orchestra, and it ends with Don Giovanni having killed the commendatore, the father of Donna Anna. In the recitativo that follows, Leporello says something absolutely ridiculous to Don Giovanni. He said, "Who died, you or the old man?" And Giovanni loses his patience and says, "What a stupid question, of course it's the old man." Now, if Leporello's line is delivered very slowly, slower than most recitativo, it can be really marvelous. Leporello, ove sei? Son qui per mia disgrazia, e voi son qui. Chi è morto? Voi o il vecchio? Che domanda deve essere il vecchio? Bravo, tu increse leggiadre. Okay. That is so much more interesting than just rattling through it at the same speed. Now, in addition to just playing the recits straight, sometimes, especially when there's action happening without any dialogue, any music, I have suggested to the pianist, and in one or two rare instances where I played my own cembalo, invented maybe like little tunes or something, little quotes from other operas to fill in the space. Some people loved it, some people didn't. This is something that you can play with a little bit in rehearsal. Finally, if you go to my book, I talk about how certain expressive details can be achieved through maybe a choice of bowing or choice of effect or changing balance for a note or two in the orchestra. And in comedy, sometimes you could even do almost like sound effects, but they must be done very, very sparingly, maybe once in the whole opera. And you can read about this too in my book. Thank you so much. I encourage you to subscribe to this channel if you haven't, to share it with your friends who you think would find it interesting, and to comment about what you've heard, and even if you want, ask a question, and within my limited ability, I will try to answer it.